Mr. Gary Hansel, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. Hansel, although a third-year law student, is inexplicably a maiden speaker at today's debate, and as a result is entitled to speak without interruption. But do you waive this right, Mr. Hansel?
I waive my right. Friends, I'd like to thank you all for coming this evening. The issue of how we deal with substance use is one of the major issues of our time. Tonight, I want to outline to you the major contours of this debate. I'll outline what drug laws purport to do, and I'll demonstrate to you why the criminalisation of drugs has been an abominable failure. I'll argue that the only way forward is for the complete legalisation of all drugs. First of all, we must ask ourselves, what do drug laws purport to do? The criminalisation of drugs purports to deter the use of drugs by using the criminal law as a deterrent, which will prevent people using these substances. As drugs are deemed to be harmful, we ought not to use them. This policy of the law purports that the harm caused by drugs is best met at the lowest level by criminalising them. This policy can be deduced to two principles. The first is normative in nature. This means that it relates to how we ought to act. As drugs are harmful, we ought not to take them. The second is empirical. The prohibition of drug use claims that the harms associated with drugs are best met by using the deterrent effect of the criminal law. Friends, these two propositions have been used in the 20th and 21st century as the means by which to prohibit drug use. Friends, these propositions are the most fallacious, ignorant, and oppressive criminal sanctions in our current society. Drug prohibition attempts to create a singular conception of the good life on society's members. It stifles alternative perspectives on the good life for those of us who do not adhere to the moral, political, and economic status quo. Moreover, drug prohibition targets and marginalises those groups in societies that are the most oppressed or represent the greatest challenge to political order. Minority groups, economically disadvantaged, and politically subversive groups are those which are most affected by drug criminalisation. Moreover, the harm reduction measures of criminalisation are not met out by empirical evidence. Every system which has addressed the negative externalities associated with drug use as a health issue rather than as a criminal issue has reaped the most rewards. Friends, I will first deal tonight with the normative issue about why we ought not to use drugs under the current law. Many drugs are legal. Alcohol, for instance, is a drug. It is widespread across our society. However, its intoxicating effects do not operate in the same mind-altering fashion as many other drugs. It does not lead to the same critical faculties which other drugs do. Coffee is another illegal drug. As many of you know, it is actually the fuel of the Enlightenment. It is a fantastic substance for productivity, which may explain why so many corporate entities give it free to their members. However, these drugs and the use thereof do not disturb the political and economic structure of the state. The use of the criminal law in prohibiting drug use determines a particular conception of the good life. I will demonstrate this by examining the historical prohibition of three of society's most widely used drugs. The first of this is cannabis, then LSD, And then finally, MDMA, otherwise known as ecstasy. I'll first begin with cannabis. Cannabis's prohibition came in the wake of the end of the prohibition of alcohol in the US in the late 1920s and early 1930s. Cannabis's use was predominant in the African American communities and the Mexican immigrant populations. After the demise of alcohol prohibition, a new evil was needed by the political order. This evil was cannabis. This substance was used particularly in the African American community and in particular by the black intelligentsia of the Harlem Renaissance. This Harlem Renaissance rejected the racism which permeated through much of society, and members engaged in literary, musical, and poetic expression. This formed the bedrock of the civil rights movement of the 1950s and the 1960s. LSD and psychedelics became prohibited in the 1960s. Again, this was part of the counterculture revolution which occurred in this period. LSD's use was central to the hippie movement and other alternative movements which grew in this period. The norms and mores which developed in these movements were completely opposite to the status quo. From this emanated different views on class, gender, sexual orientation, and sexual liberation. As these views did not subscribe to the political status quo, prohibition was the immediate response. MDMA was likewise prohibited in the 1970s and 1980s, first coming to prominence in the US in the gay community. Homophobia and a general dislike by the older demographic of this drug led to its prohibition. The empathetic effects of MDMA were at odds with the neoliberal regime at the time, which prioritized self-interest over empathy and the altruistic effects of the drug. I'll now turn on to the empirical issues. The empirical results, which have demonstrated that drug prohibition does not work. Those societies which reduce the harm of drug use are those which do not criminalize. The reason why legalization is more important than decriminalization is that the supply of drugs can be controlled. I do not support a commodification of drug use. I support it being disseminated through nationalised pharmacies which can regulate the substance and can prevent any dangerous additives being added to the drug. Friends, the criminalisation of drugs has been a complete failure. It creates a particular conception of the good life, which does not account for the views of groups which are outside of the political status quo. It exacerbates the negative externalities of drug use. Friends, the only way forward is for the legalisation of all drugs. I would ask you to support the motion. Thank you. Thank you.
I'd now call our first speaker to oppose the proposition, ladies and gentlemen, Ms. Sarah Mortel.
So, ladies and gentlemen of the University Philosophical Society, ladies and gentlemen, considering that I consider myself a liberal, broad-minded, feminist TCD student, I can see what you're thinking right now. How did this girl end up on the wrong side of cool in this debate? But I believe that there's not a blueprint for cool. There's not a blueprint for progressive, being modern-minded in terms of policy, in terms of social issues, in terms of gender. And just on an aside, if I was to give you a piece of advice, not that I'm A, qualified, or B, that you'd listen to me because I'm so cool right now, would be that as you're starting to make up your mind about certain issues in college, don't be afraid to see what falls within the realms of your belief, whether it is kind of, in terms of the, oh, that's cool, that's college man, or not. Just kind of go with it. So back to me being really, really cool. So as I'm the first speaker, I don't have much of an opportunity to respond to what's going to come out on the table here. But I can't really help but be a little bit irked by the way this debate usually goes down. So it's a debate that's usually engaged in by middle-class TCD students who just so clear because that's the demographics of my peers. But the proposition arguments that I generally put forward are a couple of fold. So the first one is that regulation in some way means better protection for the vulnerable people, meaning like cleaner drugs. And we've gotten this from the first speaker quite a bit, talking about marijuana and LSD. And the point that I would like to point out here is that these are not the drugs that are the most harmful, these are not the drugs that are the most addictive, and I'd like to see the rest of the prop bench address drugs like crack cocaine, like methadone, like heroin, like the drugs that cause the most damage and are the most habitual users in society. Then secondly, onto kind of the eradication of the black market. There's this kind of conception that, in terms of supply side, that if we legalise drugs, then it will somehow be the case that the black market is going to go underground. As if Tuco and all the labs in Mexico are going to just go completely out of business when Endo comes up with a super turbo clean lab. Like that's going to happen. Like there's not a more complicated narrative within the people who actually engage in the illegal drug trades and in the cartels in Mexico. I'm going to speak about that a little bit later on. And then on further from that, in terms of rehabilitation, that I understand that there are problems with those who have been convicted in terms of usage of drugs, in terms of finding housing further and kind of going on with their lives. But I feel like that's a different problem than drugs being legal in the first instance. So there's a couple of things that I'm very, very happy to concede. Actually, I'll talk about that in a second. So finally, the one that really, really bugs me is the kind of musing on the levels of autonomy and personal autonomy. And boo-hoo the state, you can't tell me what to do because that's not your job. I feel like that's just so far removed from reality in terms of this debate that it actually just doesn't have a place. And while I respect my peers' points and their intelligence and their witty banter, I just really can't help but feel that these arguments demonstrate a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of drug usage and, moreover, drug addiction. Because the power that drugs have is something that, cannot be minimised in this particular instance. And drug addiction and how that plays out for the individual in the individual's life is something that we cannot not take into account, even though it is a policy debate. And I would also be able to say with relative confidence that I'm currently speaking here today with not a lot of policy knowledge. I'm speaking from my heart because this is something that I feel so passionately about. Sometimes it's a little bit hard to actually get a point across and you're standing there being, what are you going to talk about for 7 minutes? But I'm going to do my best. Because I can say that I've seen the devastating effects that drugs have had on a nuclear family unit. I've pulled my friend out of a crack den after a 2-day drugs binge, and I've seen a mother at 4 a.m. in the morning outside Manchester Hospital get the news that her son is not going to wake up from the operating table because he took 1 yip too many after Swedish House Mafia. So that's where I'm coming from in this. I've seen the real devastating life effects of the people, not just the individuals, and not just their individual decision to take drugs in the first instance. And what I would say to those people who have those wonderful philosophical musings, please go make a Tumblr and not my country's policies. So, a couple of things that I would like to concede before the debate actually goes forward. And I'm so happy to concede this. I think it's important to concede this. Firstly, there has been collateral damage in terms of the war on drugs that Nixon started, 40, 50 years ago. And I understand that it has entrenched a lot of negative race relations in America and in Latin America, but I still don't feel that that's a reason why drugs themselves, in their kind of purest form, should be legalized and should be something that people actually do. I'm also happy to concede hypocrisy in that tobacco and tins are also legal. I think that tobacco, firstly, they don't actually alter your personality and alter who you are. And alcohol, I understand that that's a massive problem. But one distinction I'd like to make there is the majority of people in this room actually consume alcohol, and you're not alcoholics. The majority of people who use heroin are heroin addicts and consume their entire life. And that's a small kind of thing there. And then finally, kind of the addictive nature of drugs. What I would like to say from the first speaker, he kind of addressed the drugs that are kind of like on the scale of addiction. Isn't the worst. No, thanks, Mike. That weed actually isn't the worst, but currently in its form, it is kind of laced with a lot of bad crap, and I will concede that. But finally, kind of moving on from all those concessions onto what I actually want to talk about at 5 minutes. Sorry, guys. The general framework. So where this debate I feel lies, and where we want to acknowledge that it lies, is somewhere between the nanny state and total freedom of human beings as we go down through lives. And in this kind of debate and where we draw those lines, and why it's legitimate for governments to draw lines, is where we see that not only the effect that something has on the actor and the individual themselves, but the effect that it has on other people thereafter. So for example, in terms of smoking, people are allowed to smoke themselves, and that's not a freedom that people are inhibited to actually make that decision to do, but people are not allowed to smoke within certain limits of buildings because it is kind of infringing on other people who don't choose to smoke on their right to have, to not actually get secondhand smoke. You do it in terms of seatbelts. It's illegal not to wear your seatbelt, not because you can go and actually not wear your seatbelt and kind of harm yourself, but if your body flies at me at 70 miles an hour, that's me not consenting to the harm that you're causing. In terms of jaywalking as well, I'm I'm going to move on quite quickly because I feel like I'm running out of time. But basically, one thing that I would like to address in my final minutes, and I really don't have enough time, is drug dealers and the drug trade. So I feel that there is not going to be any eradication of the black market drugs trade, only an aggressive transformation to something that we actually just don't want to see. Because I feel the black market is going to be driven further underground, making it harder to detect and harder to actually connect with people who are in those rings. The production will not stop because the nature of the drug trade goes beyond just what we see. It goes in terms of turf wars, in terms of exploiting women, exploiting poor people. And it's not just as simple as what we see on the surface. And unfortunately, these people are going to continue to make drugs and undercut what Enda and the lads are going to be actually producing. And what we see then is, given the nature of addiction, which I haven't had time to actually go into, but the nature of addiction itself means that people who are addicted and who just want their next fix, and unfortunately reality is clouded out a little bit for those people who actually do engage with hardcore drugs, they're going to just go and they're just going to get the cheapest option, the quickest option, and they're going to go for the one that is still most harmful for them. So I still don't feel that legalising drugs is actually correcting for the problem that it is originally trying to correct for. So just really, is that my two? Okay, that's me done. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, I would really implore you to think about everything that people say on both sides and don't just not listen to me because I'm a big stiff prude. And while it may be the good life for one, and we're talking about the good life for one, please think about the lives of many people and the people on from just that one individual. Thank you very much.
Our second speaker for the proposition, the founder of the Transform Drug Policy Foundation, ladies and gentlemen, Kushlick.
Good evening, Dublin. Firstly, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm going to speak about this as the founder of Transform, so very much from a policy point of view, but also someone who's seen this at first hand in a previous life. Transform is a charity. We're a think tank and a campaign group for the end of the war on drugs, the end of the global prohibition, and to enable countries, states, to put in place effective, just and humane systems of legal regulation and control. We have offices in Bristol, London, and fairly recently in Mexico City, more of which later. So we want to get drugs under government control. We're not ideologues, we're campaigners for social justice. We want to do this because the prohibition, criminalisation, and let's remember it's not of drugs, it's of people. And it's not the legalisation of drugs, it's the legalisation of acts performed by people. We want a public policy that meets the needs of the majority and especially the most marginalised and disadvantaged. I think that both sides in this debate have a lot of common ground. My guess is, without my glasses, that we all want to protect the young and vulnerable. We want to reduce crime, we want to improve health, we want to promote security and development. We want to provide good value for money. We want to protect human rights. But the experience of the past 50 years demonstrates that prohibition cannot achieve these aims and in fact actively undermines them. We have 5 methods that we suggest. They're all in play now in terms of what legally regulating drugs means. It means prescribing them by doctors. It means dispensing them from pharmacies, selling them under license, having on licenses and off licenses, and the last one is unlicensed sales, which we currently have for tea and coffee, for instance. Your job, if I can be so bold to suggest what it is tonight, is to weigh the prophylactic, the protective elements of each of these policies, prohibition and legalisation, against their destructive elements. There is a spectrum of drug control that runs through from prohibition at one end, which effectively deregulates the market. If you want to see the free market red in tooth and claw, watch the way that violence is used in the illegal market. Still, it's a huge market. At the other end, we have a free market, which we have for alcohol and tobacco. where the industry controls the trade, it's legal, but it's almost completely ungoverned, and the industry do pretty much what they want. Although having said that, there are moves now to put more regulation and control on those currently illicit drugs. And what we want to see is a place in the middle, between those two extremes, where we have strict government regulation and control. So why do we want to see change? Because prohibition is one of the greatest public policy catastrophes of modern times. The global spend on prohibition is estimated at $100 billion a year. That's billion, thousand million, $100,000 million a year. There are 240 million users worldwide, most of whom don't have a problem with their drug use, a minority who do, but neither of those groups are helped by being criminalised. The business has a turnover of 320 billion, so you're spending 100 billion to fight the war on drugs that creates a trade value of 320. The figures just don't add up. It's one of the largest commodity trades on earth. It undermines the security of entire regions, very obviously in Latin America and increasingly now in Africa. But don't believe me on this. Listen to Antonio. Antonio wrote a very astute and cogent paper in 2008 where he identified what he called 5 major unintended consequences of the current drug control system, which is prohibition. The first one is the creation of vast criminal black market. That's what prohibition does, according to Antonio, with the UN Office on Drugs and Crime. That then destabilises Afghanistan, Africa. The US has a prison population amounted to 25%, has 25% of the world's prison population, 5% of the world's population, and overwhelmingly black, 40% of whom are non-violent drug offenders. Mexico has seen the deaths of 80,000 people over the last 4 or 5 years in turf wars, 20,000 disappeared. Think St. Valentine's Day massacre. Alcohol prohibition is a very clear historical comparison for this. They have a St. Valentine's Day massacre every day, 30 people. The opportunity cost of fighting the war on drugs is that all that money could be spent on something useful rather than gifting a massive trade to organised criminals and unregulated dealers. It could be spent on health, for instance. So Antonio identified this. There's a problem when you spend all your money on enforcement because you don't spend it on other useful initiatives. The balloon effect is another thing he identified. If you squeeze supply and production in one area, all you do is move it somewhere else, creating absolute chaos, which is now hitting Africa. Substance displacement, he also identified. So if you win the war against one drug, all that happens is another one takes its place. The last one he identified was stigma attached to people who use drugs, who then find it difficult to access treatment, and in many countries experience human rights abuses. Ultimately, prohibition fails because the number of users is so high on a global basis. We've got that many users, and the prices and profits are so high. Markups of 2,000, 3,000%. There isn't a commodity trade to touch that. Certainly not at this level, with that level of access by people with no business acumen. Yep?
Why do you feel a death sentence drug such as crystal meth is a legitimate commodity?
Why do
you feel a death sentence drug such as crystal meth is a legitimate commodity for human beings to consume?
The thing is, the reality is that people consume it. There isn't a fantasy that we can create where people don't use drugs. And if we're after that, really, Alice in Wonderland is where we need to go. We have to deal with the fact that people are using these things. And if we allow the criminal market to do it, we create so many more problems. So Antonio and Neil will tell us that use will rise. Availability will increase, use will rise, and everything will get much worse. The fact is, use already has risen to a level vast enough to support one of the largest commodity trades on earth. That train left the station many, many years ago. If we can keep use down, we can. Too late. That's gone. So that we now have one of the largest trades on earth run by paramilitaries, power politicians, and transnational organised criminals. So now for regulation. We want to legalise and regulate drugs not because they're safe, but precisely because they're dangerous. The trade already exists, we need to take it back, and we need to reduce the harm. One of the people who's recently started campaigning for legalisation and regulation is a woman called Anne-Marie Coburn, whose daughter died after taking ecstasy last year. And the reason why she is campaigning for change is because it is her view that had Martha known what she was using, the amount and the purity, that she would still be with us. And her suggestion is for anyone who wants to hang on to prohibition, that they go and tell Martha that. Are governments brilliant at regulating drugs? Nope. But they're a lot worse at prohibiting them. Are humans brilliant at regulating their own drug use? No. But criminalisation doesn't improve self-control. What we're talking about here is the least worst option. I'm not presenting a panacea for all the ills of globalised capitalism. I'm not presenting a solution for addiction. Having said that, a legally regulated environment does provide a much better context to help people. I'm not providing a solution for corrupt and or inept governments or incompetent and fragile states. But legalising drugs, for instance, even though Afghanistan virtually doesn't have a state, if you legalised and regulated opium production for recreational use, the Afghans wouldn't grow opium anymore. It wouldn't be a problem. What we're looking at is a replacement for a catastrophically failed system that's failed year in, year out. It failed with prohibition. They knew what was going to happen and they went and did it again on a global scale. Good news is legalisation is coming to a country near you. Washington, Colorado have now legalised cannabis for recreational purposes. Uruguay will do so very soon. In the next 5 years, it will come to Ireland. We need to be ready when it does. I urge you to support the motion, and more importantly, I urge you to support the campaign for change. I thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kushlick. I now call our next speaker to oppose the proposition, the former Executive Director of the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, Dr.Antonio Maria Costa.
This meeting is going to be tough. Young people, students in particular, tend to favor legalization. But I will try my best to convince you to think otherwise. And let me begin. Ladies and gentlemen, despite the wording, this motion is not really about drug legalization. In fact, we are asked to vote whether an option to side with the common people and protect health, or two, to side with those who expect huge returns from investing in drugs. It's just as simple as that. The motion is about public health versus private profits. I invite you to oppose it. And I shall give you 3 reasons to oppose the motion. The first reason is factual, data. For over a century, countries have unanimously agreed that drugs are dangerous to health and must be controlled. Over time, the controls on drugs have protected public health. At the end. Listen to these numbers. Tobacco is traded freely, as referred to earlier, consumed by 1/3 of the world population. It kills 6 million people a year. Alcohol is freely consumed by 1/4 of humanity, then in certain countries, Muslim countries, it kills 3 million people a year. Half the tobacco-related death. Drugs. They are universally controlled and thus consumed by a fraction of humanity. Occasional use, occasional. 5% of the world population, 300 million people. regular daily use, 0.5% of the world population, 30 million people. Tobacco kills 6 million people. Alcohol, 3 million people. Drugs kill 500,000 people. Less than 1/10 the tobacco kills. My first conclusion, drug controls, despite what you heard earlier, have protected humanity so well. In fact, there is a strong push now to control tobacco by means of agreements similar to those between drugs. My second point is moral. Of course, it looks libertarian to claim that people should decide whether to do drugs or not. In fact, it is not a question of freedom of choice. It is a question of money. Big money. The worst sort of capitalism that is pushing for drug legalization. My evidence? The pro-drug lobby has deliberately shifted the drug debate from drugs as a health question, from prevention and therapy, into drugs as a market question, how to make money out of addiction. I find it immoral to treat addicts not as people in need of treatment, but as cash cows whose illness they wish to turn into an Eldorado. I urge the young, idealistic people in this hall to enlist and stop the big tobacco companies, the big pharmaceutical company referred earlier, the hedge funds, and so many private investors from developing drug brands, drug business models, and drug marketing plans. It is all a question of money, big money. The drug Eldorado was mentioned earlier. It's about 300 billion a year. If it were a country, would have a GDP the 20th largest in the world. If legalization wins, in the future there will be no more drug mafias, no single. No need for that. Drugs will be produced and sold by blue chip companies listed in the city or in Wall Street, leading to privatization of investor gains and socialization of health losses. This is not so good. So the pro-drug coalition can even count on all the politicians who see promising tax revenue from the drug trade. You may recall that legalization of drugs was suggested to Greece as a way to avoid taxes. I conclude with a third point, with an historical meaning. I refer to your neighbor, the empire that for centuries imposed drugs on other nations. As you may know, in the early 1800s, British foreign trade was deep in red, so colonialists engineered an evil plot, buy cheap opium from India and impose its use in China with high margins. The British East India Company in particular made huge profits, but the dog trade, the opium trade, was a catastrophe for China with millions of addicts, deaths and war. When the Chinese tried to oppose this trade, the British reacted with 2 military expeditions. The Chinese were defeated in 2 opium wars, and drug legalization was imposed in China until World War II, until Mao Zedong. What's happening at present is not different. Big guns impose drug legalization there. Big money is pushing for drug legalization now. So be very careful as you watch today. Don't side with those who intend to exploit addiction. Don't support contemporary opium wars. Ladies and gentlemen, to close, I address those who support the motion. Danny earlier said that in the celebrated papers, he said, I recognize the weaknesses of the current system. I still do, and I will do forever. From an operational perspective, drug policies have often criminalized addicts instead of treating them, and they should be treated. In some countries, policies have resulted in a violation of human rights. From a security perspective, drug controls have generated a criminal drug market that causes violence from Mexico to West Africa to our own ghettos here. So what do I propose? Instead of legalizing drugs to the benefit of big investors, First, let's treat addiction as an illness, send the addicts to hospital rather than to jail. Second, fight corruption that is rampant in drug-producing countries, and drug trafficking countries, Central America, the Balkans, and so forth. Above all, fight money laundering with the toughest means. This is not happening today. Think of the Wachovia Bank in New York, caught recycling 480 billions of Mexican drug money. No penalty, no indictment. The bank is still operating. And the same bank, and the same JP Morgan, and the same Deutsche Bank, and UBS. I cannot think of a single bank that has not been tainted by drug money. To conclude, don't be swayed by the simplistic argument, I do whatever I want with my body. In fact, legalization offers you a body to profit seekers. Refuse to be exploited, switch to the no side, and be proud of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Maria Costa. I now call our second student speaker for the proposition, ladies and gentlemen, Michael Park.
Okay. Broadly speaking, two things happen when you try to criminalize drugs, when you try to punish people for using them, or for having them, or for selling them, or for being used. Two things happen. One is that a lot of people who don't deserve to be in prison get put in prison. That's bad in itself. It's also bad in a variety of other ways, which is the social fallout we'll talk about later. And two is that, unfortunately for them, given that this is all they want to talk about, more people take drugs. Right? So like, insofar as that's an empirical fact that I'll also talk about later on, that'll also create a couple of problems for them. I want to talk about, broadly speaking, just those two things. I do have two very brief responses to the last speech that you heard. First, the death comparison that Dr. Costa chose to open with, that fewer people die from cannabis every year, or die from drugs every year rather, than die from alcohol. The reason for that is because alcohol is more dangerous than drugs, right? The correlation is consistently that criminalizing drugs means that more people take drugs. If he thinks that drugs are more dangerous than alcohol, are more likely to kill people than alcohol, then what we'd actually see is a correlation whereby drug deaths go up when you criminalize them. That is what we see. There's plenty of evidence for that. But that point doesn't work on their side of the package. Secondly, all of this material about big firms and private profit. Everyone who's spoken on Prof so far has been incredibly clear that they're not in favor of opening drugs up to a free market. They're not in favor of private profiteering, that they want massive state regulation, massive state intervention when it comes to the distribution of drugs. Recognize that the status quo when anyone buys drugs is that it's a completely unregulated market. It's a completely free market because it's a complete black market. The government has no involvement in it whatsoever. If you think that free markets are really bad for drug policy, then you should start regulating them. The only way you can regulate them is by actually accepting that they exist, actually legalizing them. The same thing is true, incidentally, of the opium wars, which we're also not in favor of. But that's not a thing that anyone here is proposing, right? Those points aren't arguments against the case that we'll actually make. Two things then that happen when you criminalize drugs. The first is incarceration. When you give police officers the mandate and the imperative to go out and to find people who are taking drugs and who are using drugs, who are selling drugs, and to use the force of the law to punish those people, let's talk about the kind of people that they actually target when they're doing that. So first, obviously this is filtered by the kinds of people who are likely to take really hard drugs. Those communities, everyone in this room knows it, are more likely to be deprived. Like hard drug use of heroin, use of crystal meth, use of crack. And much higher amongst incredibly deprived communities where people are enormously poor, and when they are forced by that deprivation into taking drugs, those are the people who are more likely to be targeted by the police. Secondly, those people are more likely to be targeted because the police disproportionately target those communities when they enforce any laws at all. It is much more likely, if you're working class or if you're non-white, that you're going to be stopped and searched. Drug laws are a huge part of that kind of racial antagonism between police and between non-white and working class groups, because they provide an excellent excuse for randomly stopping and searching people. They're an amazing cover for police harassment. That's a huge problem. Those are also the kinds of groups that go to jail. And third, note that the people who sell drugs, the people who produce drugs and import drugs, are disproportionately not the people who get punished by drug laws. 15,400 people were charged with drug-related offences in this country last year. Of those, 400 were charged with the actual import or the manufacture of drugs. The other 15,000 were charged with offences that weren't import or manufacture. A few hundred of those were selling drugs. Almost all of the rest of them were just using or possessing drugs. Disproportionately, these laws don't actually hit the people that they tell us are really bad, like the drug pushers. They just hit the victims of those people, the people who end up taking those drugs. What we get then are massive increases in incarceration rates. These correlate perfectly with drug criminalisation efforts, with drug crackdowns, in like anywhere in the Arctic for any historical period of time. Like it's true with prohibition. More recently, it's true that the Irish prison rate, the Irish prison population, has grown fourfold since 1970. The US prison population has grown fivefold since 1980. That correlates perfectly with Reagan's crackdown on drugs. In particular, the rate of growth in the US prison population went up 1,000% in the same year in which Reagan's 1986 comprehensive drug crackdown policies were passed. These are people who are incredibly poor, who are incredibly underprivileged, who are incredibly vulnerable, and those facts have driven them into taking drugs, and they're being punished by the police, they're being imprisoned literally in their millions as a consequence of this. That's a harm in itself. Like, that's an incredibly horrible thing to do for those people. It's robbing years of their lives, and it should be a sufficient reason to oppose this motion. If it's not, though, I mean, if there are some sociopaths in the room, there are a couple of reasons why this might also just be a counterproductive policy, right? One is that those levels of incarceration, those levels of criminalisation, breed further crime. Prisons create gangs, gangs create more crime. Importantly, gangs produce more drugs. Secondly, people who go to prison are disproportionately more likely to take drugs. 45% of people in the Irish prison system who are addicted to heroin tried heroin for the first time when they were in prison. People who go to prison are much more likely to take drugs than people who are not in prison. If you don't want people to take drugs, maybe stop putting them there. Right? Those rates of incarceration are massively counterproductive. They're completely unconscionable. They're probably the main reason why you should oppose this. What's the balance, though? I mean, if they want to tell you that ultimately this is weighed up against a reduction in drug use, let's talk about that, because that's not true either. We can test this. Like, we can test whether it's true that when you pass laws designed to make people stop taking drugs, they stop taking drugs. Because we can measure, roughly speaking, how many people take drugs, and we can also know the years in which we pass those laws. No one has found a particularly compelling correlation between the illegalization, the criminalization of a substance, between crackdowns on that substance, and decreases in its usage. Quite the contrary. So again, you go back to Prohibition-era America, alcohol consumption falls briefly, and then it skyrockets well past its like pre-prohibition rates. Same is true of Finland, same is true of Russia, same is true of Canada, when they attempted prohibition. More importantly, though, it happens in the present day. Why? A couple of reasons. One is because the kind of mass incarceration that I just talked about massively impoverishes people. Like when you break up families, when you destroy workforces, when you force people into long-term unemployment and poverty because they're ex-cons, they're much more likely to take drugs in the future. Second is because of the exact problem of regulation that Dr. Costa wants you to worry about. People who sell drugs currently do so in an absolute free market. They do so with absolute impunity. There is nothing to stop them lying about the product that they're selling. There is nothing to stop them from coercing people into taking it. There is nothing to stop them from selling it to the most vulnerable people, including children. Those are all things that the state is quite good at stopping people from doing. Those things are much less likely to happen when you don't have those kind of things. If you look at, for example, drug consumption rates between 1998 and 2008, opiate consumption worldwide up 1/3, cocaine consumption worldwide up 1/4, cannabis up 1/10. There is no evidence for the claim that these laws make people less likely to take drugs. Finally, on a basic point of health, if you are worried about overdose, if you are worried about people dying because of the drugs that they take, just know that if it is a crime for you to take drugs, you are much more likely to take drugs incredibly secretly. You are much more likely to be that much further from a hospital, that much further from an ambulance, that much further from the medical care that you will need to actually accidentally overdose. Note that schemes like those which exist in Canada, whereby people are able to legally inject drugs at certain sites, don't have accidental deaths. Like, they have massively reduced rates of accidental death. Note that countries with decriminalisation also have massively reduced rates of accidental death. Drug laws victimize the poorest, they don't make fewer people take drugs, and they do make far more people die because of drugs. They're incredibly immoral, they're incredibly counterproductive, and I'm incredibly proud to propose. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Barton. I'd like to invite now the second of our guest speakers to oppose the motion. Would you please welcome Professor Neil McKeganey, founder of the Centre for Drug Misuse Research.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the invitation. And the fact that this debate is so well attended gives an indication of just how important this topic. But you know, when my colleagues today asked me where I was going today, I said I was going to take part in a debate in Trinity on drug legalisation. They said, well, what's the point of that? Students are going to vote in favour of drug legalisation, unquestionably. You'll never get a vote in favour of prohibition. And I can see why they were saying that, but I want you to do something which is in some sense maybe quite difficult, which is when you think about this issue, think about it, truly, consider it. Don't respond to it as a student body. Think about it yourself. And don't think about this motion in terms of, do you want to smoke cannabis and not risk prosecution? This motion is not about whether you should be allowed to smoke cannabis without fear of prosecution. This is a motion about effectively legalising every single drug that is currently available and every single drug that may be developed from this point on. And it's the second half of that equation which in a sense you should worry about most. Because novel psychoactive substances, the so-called legal highs, are being produced now so rapidly, so quickly, and distributed through the internet so widely that we now have no idea about the content of the drugs that are now being sold legally in many countries. We don't know. It took government scientists over a year to work out what was in one of the legal high drugs. Now, if I wanted to set up a legal high shop or a novel psychoactive market in this city, I could concoct some fancy, highly deadly as it turned out, drug cocktail, and I could give it an attractive name. And if I succeeded in winning a market to that, if I persuaded significant numbers of people in this room to come to my shop and buy it, according to Danny Kushlick, there'd be no point prosecuting me for that because I'd actually persuaded people to buy it. He'd be quite happy with that. He doesn't want the criminal law to come along and say, actually, Neil, you cannot sell that substance in this city because you are causing the deaths of many individuals when you do that. Now, if you vote for a motion which effectively says any drug now and any drug in the future should be legal, that is in a sense what you're voting for. It's not cannabis, it's not LSD, it's not even heroin. It's any drug that may be developed. Now, it was proposed by the previous speaker that prohibition has simply not worked, that actually making drugs illegal has resulted in more people using illegal drugs. Well, how many people in this room would estimate that the proportion of people using heroin is the equivalent of the proportion of people using tobacco and alcohol? It's not. It's a fraction. Less than 1% of this society is using heroin. Now, why is less than 1% of people using heroin compared to 60% using alcohol and 15% using tobacco? The reason is not because heroin is unpleasant to use. Actually, many people regard it as a very pleasant drug to use, much more pleasant than alcohol or tobacco. The reason it is used so rarely is because people know that there is a criminal sanction associated with its use. Now you may feel, sorry, I don't have enough time to take so many questions, but you may feel that you would rather drug use were treated solely as a health issue and not as a criminal justice issue, because you feel that the police in some sense are an antagonistic force in society. But if in years to come, when you are living in your semi-detached home, somebody sets up a drug den next to your house, and your children are being veiled into a drug den, who are you going to call to respond to that problem? You're not going to call a social worker or a drugs counsellor. You are going to call the police, because it will be the police who will take that action to stem the flow of drugs in that community. And you will want their assistance at that point. Now, much has been made of the situation in the United States, where within 2 states it looks like drugs, or cannabis at least, is well on the way to becoming entirely legal. Colorado, it has been. Washington, it probably will be. And you could feel pretty optimistic about that, and it may be that what happens in Colorado will in due course happen here. But actually, what has happened in Colorado in the period since cannabis was legally available for recreational use? Well, in 2006, 5% of fatal road accidents in Colorado involved drivers who tested positive. That went up to 13%. The national average of cannabis use amongst young people in the United States in the 12 to 17 age range is 7.6%. 7.6% of 12 to 17-year-olds across the United States have current use of marijuana. In Colorado, it's 10.7%. Amongst adults in the 18 to 25 age range, nationally it's 18%. In Colorado, it's 28%. ER admissions have started to go up. We see in Colorado more cannabis outlets than there are Starbucks cafes. More cannabis outlets than there are Starbucks cafes. In the past, a small number of people were registered to provide marijuana for medical use. That figure has now leapt to well over 100,000. Now, the advocates of legalisation will tell you that if you legalise drugs, there will not be an increase in their use. That everyone who now currently wants to use illegal drugs is already using them. And yet Transform, in the past, produced a report which envisaged a 100% increase in the levels of heroin use in society. Now, a 100% increase in heroin use in society would take that from 1% to 2%. Now, it is entirely possible that heroin use, if it were fully legalised, could acquire a level of use which is way beyond 2%. You could see a situation where 10, 15, 20% of the population here were using heroin. Now, if anybody thinks that would be a desirable outcome, you need to consider the reality of what that would be like. That would be overdose deaths in a regular occurrence on the streets. That would be record levels of addiction. That would be your medical services overwhelmed by the proportion of people who are coming in dependent on this drug. And again, remember, this motion isn't about legalising heroin. It's about legalising absolutely everything. Now, we had great success in reducing rates of drug-related drink driving. And many of you can be more confident now as you drive in the city or cross the roads in the city that a reduced proportion of the drivers in the city are driving under the influence of alcohol. You can actually enjoy that greater freedom in the knowledge that you stand less chance now of being knocked over by a car driven by a drunk driver than in the past. Now, why did the drink drive laws, why did they work so well? They worked so well, not because there was an appeal to the driver, please don't drink and drive your car, but because you passed laws which made drink driving illegal. You empowered the police to stop driving. You developed testing equipment to say, I don't care whether you say you've drunk or not, I will test you, and if you are over a certain limit, you will be prosecuted. Now, the consequences of that were a dramatic reduction in drink driving in this city and in other cities across the world. But criminal law was used to protect the public. And that is exactly what happens in relation to illegal drugs. These are not harmless substances. David Nutt will tell you that many of the substances that are currently available are less harmful than alcohol and tobacco. And that is true. But is that a reason to have these drugs more widely available? I don't think so. But what if the drugs that are developed are more harmful than alcohol and tobacco? The legal high drugs? Are we going to say, because we have alcohol and tobacco available, that these other drugs should also be similarly legal? Would you feel that that was a positive development? Would you support a motion that said in this city and this country and in every other country, every single currently illegal drug and every other drug that gets developed, that should be illegal? that the criminal law has no role whatsoever to play. Now, when we looked recently in Scotland at the impact of drug enforcement operations in an area of high drug dealing, the police concentrated their activities in that area. And it wasn't pleasant for those people who were selling drugs in that area. But what was the outcome? The outcome wasn't hundreds of people put in prison. The outcome actually was a dramatic increase in the number of people going into treatment. The numbers of people contacting drug treatment services. Now that is a positive outcome. I am not advocating that anybody who uses cannabis should get a jail sentence and a criminal record for life. That is fundamentally unfair and inhumane. But that doesn't mean to say that there is no positive role associated with maintaining the criminal law in relation to illegal drug use. And I urge you to think very seriously before voting in favour of a proposal that legalises absolutely everything. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor McKeganey. I now call on our second speaker in favour of the proposition. Would you please welcome Co-President of the European College of Neuropsychopharmacology, Dr. David Nutt.
Well, it's unusual to be introduced as that. Normally I'm introduced as the UK government drugs advisor who was sacked by the government. And, I don't know if you were trying to avoid that confrontation or whether you didn't know, but what I'm going to tell you tonight is the reason I got sacked. I just hope that you're a little bit more liberal in the way you deal with me than the British government was. If not, then I'm going to leave soon. I'll start off by just addressing some of the issues that have been raised by the previous speakers, which are actually trying to persuade you to vote against the motion by scaring you into a situation of which is a rather fanciful situation. There were some errors in what they said. So let me just tell you a few things. I mean, the most toxic drug in the world is available. You can buy it. Actually, it's not easy to buy, but you can buy it. It's called botulinum toxin. No one buys it and uses it, apart from people who want to actually change the way in which they have creases in their face, the Botox. So it's extremely toxic, but it's available in a regulated fashion. As far as I know, no one's ever died of it. So the idea that legalising drugs would produce a whole swathe of drugs that you would take to kill yourself is really a bit naive. I think most of you are rather more wise than that. And if you want to know about a policy which will allow access to drugs, then you just need to read the Transform papers in the book. You know, they have thought it through very thoroughly. You can have a market which would allow access to drugs in a regulated fashion safely. Yes?
Yeah, you gave the example of Botox,
Yeah.
but of course what the Botox that is being sold by doctors isn't going to have a lethal dose in it. However, we are saying legalise all drugs here. So we are
not saying commercialise them and allow them to be sold by the drinks and tobacco industry. So as I say, Transform have a policy. The second thing I would point out, the first speaker was wrong in her science. Actually, the most addictive drug of all is tobacco. 40% of people who ever use tobacco become addicted. And the rates for heroin are about 25%, cocaine and crack about 25%, alcohol about 10%, and cannabis 4%. So we actually have available drugs which are more addictive than drugs which are illegal. I would also want to make the moral argument. People have made the moral argument about why should you put yourself at risk from using drugs. My view is this, the moral argument is very clear. A society, what's on the table in a debating society, a drug as toxic as alcohol is a very strange society. A society which only allows its young people to become intoxicated legally with something as toxic as alcohol is actually doing a disservice to young people and is increasing the harms to them. Making drugs less harmful than alcohol available recreationally would save lives because less of you would die from alcohol poisoning. In the UK today, and I'm almost certain if you had the data in Ireland it would be the same, alcohol is the leading cause of death in men between the ages of 16 and 50. The leading cause of death in men. And the way women are drinking, it'll be the leading cause of death in women within a decade too.
Yeah.
And then I want to just talk about the scare stories about Colorado. So Neil told you about increased cannabis consumption in Colorado. But what he didn't tell you was that just the availability of medical marijuana, which leaks into the general population, has led to an 18% reduction in deaths on the road from heavy alcohol consumption. Because cannabis is a safer drug than alcohol. And the idea that making more drugs available is going to cause more harm, in fact, is fallacious. The likelihood is that reducing alcohol consumption would lead to less harms overall, which is one of the main reasons I think it's morally wrong for society to force people to use alcohol when they get intoxicated. You should have more choice. And now what I want to say is about legal highs. Yes, some legal highs are toxic. The reason people are dying of legal highs is not because they are taking ecstasy. They're not. They're taking drugs like PMA and PMMA, which were made simply because the attempts to prohibit the production of MDMA were successful. So the producers, instead of having sassafras oil to make MDMA, switched to linseed oil. Linseed oil makes a much more toxic substance. So the people who died, the hundreds of people who've died in this country, the UK, from PMA poisoning, would not have died if MDMA was available. And if it was available in a regulated fashion, almost none of them would have died. And then I want to finish by telling you about the issue that really exercises me most of all. The drug laws enacted in the 1960 and 71 UN conventions are the most oppressive restraint on research, particularly medical research, there has ever been in the history of the world. They have effectively stopped research on cannabis, on LSD, on psilocybin, on MDMA for 50 years. And all those drugs have enormous potential utility as treatments. And it's outrageous that you and your parents and your grandparents are denied access to these possible medical therapies simply because the UN believed, fallaciously, that banning them would somehow stop recreational use. We've had no impact on recreational use, or even if we have, does it matter? What we have done is stop medical research. And as I say, this is the most outrageous insult to the medical and scientific research profession, the greatest banning of research in the history of the world. The one exception, which you'll appreciate in this country, is when the Catholic Church banned the telescope in 1616. The banning of drugs for 45 years is worse than that because of course the massive increase in research capability in those periods. Yes, Antonio.
What you just said, David, I'm afraid is not accurate. The UN Convention allowed the use of any drug for research.
But what's interesting, you can allow something by law, but you can de facto ban it. Yes, it is legal to work with LSD, but in the 50 years since it has been banned, there has not been a single study, except for one published last month from Switzerland and one published last night by us. Say the law allows, but the practice denies. And that is the worst kind of deceit. And you should resist it, and you should support this motion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Not our final speaker to oppose the proposition tonight, ladies and gentlemen, Lorna Staines.
Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, I want to tell you one thing about myself before we enter this debate, because as my opposition told me, apparently it's uncool to be here. I have used drugs. I have enjoyed several of the illegal drugs I've taken, but I still stand, and I would also really enjoy to be able to get clean, pure stuff that I didn't have to worry about from a pharmacist.
But I still stand on my side of the opposition, and proudly so, because it does not stand as to whether you would like to be able to get good cannabis. It stands for what does it mean for society to say something is legal? What does it say when we say something's okay? And are there ramifications for that? And I'm going to stand here tonight and tell you to look at the harmful drugs we allow, to look at how we treat them, and how they are negatively affecting us as a society, and why increasing other more dangerous drugs like crack cocaine, by putting them on that same level, is more harmful. So firstly, I'm going to do like a small amount of rebuttal. So for the last speaker, David, he brought up this whole we're hurt the medical community. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm a psychologist. If you want another group who've been as banned about letting people do things, welcome to us. We would learn rapid amounts more if we were allowed to put a child in a box and see would it develop language onto. But for some reason, it's considered morally abhorrent. We do things for science, and sometimes we have to make sacrifices, and we stand that this is one of them, that we stand that there are more dangers to legalising all drugs than the potential help of medical. No, thank you. So moving on to why I have some problems with what anything on Prof can tell you. They've told you that there are long-term, like David just told you, that alcohol is the biggest threat to people. There are in fact no long-term studies done in the world on the long-term effect ramifications of MDA. Not one. The only thing we've concluded is that it's similar to the tablets for insomniacs, who, when they're so dependent on it, when they come off it, immediately become insomniacs. There's concluded that the damages they do are probably long-term. There's no evidence for this. Heroin, there's no addicts alive to do a long-term study. There's no addicts who've been on it for 30 years that we can do a long-term study. And on that stance, we do not have evidence that these are like long-term, not bad for you. So MDMA is one of these ones they say is non-addictive, so it's okay. There's evidence that it harms your memory, that it harms your legacy, but there's no long-term evidence. So bear in mind that is a premise that we would enter going, hopefully if you use drugs for a long time, it won't hurt you. Secondly, I want to talk about why there's a difference, like alcohol, they are correct, is incredibly dangerous drugs, but why there's a difference between it and why there's a difference between that and that. So alcohol affects your brain, okay? It does affect your neurotransmitters, it slows them down. Drugs like cocaine, like methamphetamines, they target your neurotransmitters, which is how your brain tells yourself. They create artificial things within your brain, like serotonin, which gives you this rush, gives you this high, makes you happy. Like, why is this important? Because how they affect you is very different. So, there's this belief in overdoses because you take too much. In fact, in about 70% of cases, that's not true. What is happening is, you're in a bad mood, or you're not feeling like you want to be taking drugs. You're not feeling the mood, but you're an addict, so you take them. What happens then is your body doesn't create the right amount of counteraction to this. This is actually proven. It doesn't create the right amount of counteraction to this, and you overdose. That is where 70% of heroin addicts go, is because they're in an environment where they don't feel like they're going to take drugs. That does not happen with alcohol, because for some reason Prof has ignored that drugs are dangerous. They told you a lot about them, but ignored the fact they are dangerous. If you are in a bad mood the day you take heroin for the first time in this legal world, you could die. Not because it's impure, not because it's not good for you, but it isn't. Not because it's impure, not because you haven't given the right quality, but because drugs are different to alcohol in the very fact that how they target your brain is different to any substance we allow in the world, and that is important. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about the abuse of drugs we do use in society. They are completely correct to say that alcohol and cigarettes are incredibly bad for you. A binge of drinking, which is what hurts you, is 6 units of alcohol within a 5-hour period. That is 3 pints or 6 shots. I'm going to make a bet most of you binged on Freshers Week, okay? Like most of you have done this in this room within a week tonight and said, guys, actually I binged on drugs. I had 3 yolks, 2 tabs, and a bit of cocaine to see what the fuss was about, okay? You would all sit back and go, Jesus, what are you doing to yourself? And why is it that we see that? Why is it that what I can see is more dangerous to have alcohol? Why is it that we'll go, oh, wasn't that hilarious when your man fell over and blacked out drunk and I couldn't remember how to stand and couldn't remember his name? Why is it that we think that is funny? But if I told you I bounced off the walls for 6 hours so I took all those drugs because I binged on them, then you'd be like, what do you do with your life? Get your shit together. Sorry. I'm proposing that the reason we do this is because they are illegal. Because we inherently think that if something is illegal, that there is a danger. There's a reason we have chosen to do this. There's a reason we've made that decision. I'm saying that government has said they're bad. The reason that drink aware ads don't work as well is because our government says we can have them. In fact, we can have them as much as we like. Like, there's an obvious flaw. Like, the fact that we can't, like, the fact that binging is okay, because our government says it's okay, and we can just access what we want, we can now just drink. We now drink to see what will happen. We drink because we don't think it's dangerous. No, thank you. We drink because we are not aware of the dangers, because our government has said it's okay. They said it's legal. It says it's something we can just do, and it's become so normal in society, it's on our table. Why is that different to drugs? Because they do have longer term damage that we don't know about. They do have shorter term damage that we don't know about. So the final thing I'm going to talk about is this, and it's essentially what I've had a massive problem with is like everyone will tell it, like people have talked about drugs as if they're all this one standard effect. So we're going to imagine for a second, I'm sneaking up, I've given everyone at this table a tab of a yoke, okay? It's been about an hour, right? At this moment, Sarah's about to come up and bounce off the walls for a few hours, Mike is going to want to talk to absolutely everyone in the corner, and let's say David is going to start seeing small hallucinations, okay? That is true, that is something that they are totally valid things that can happen within that realm. It's also true to say that all of their come downs will be completely different. When your serotonin levels, which is what makes you happy, are so depleted that you can't feel happy for days after, which is what a side effect of MDMA for the first time you use it. You cannot make yourself physically happier. There's a thing called Suicide Tuesday, which is the effect of having had MDMA over the weekend. You are so depleted of serotonin, your depression increases. Ladies and gentlemen, and the same remains true for acid. Like, there's just things that I cannot tell you will be safe. So, because I say that currently we abuse the drugs, which probably should have more sanctions on, because how we treat them now is important, because illegality seems to be what gives us the power to keep people afraid of them, to keep people wary of them, then if that is all we can gain from illegality, then it's still something worth gaining. I beg you to oppose.